The alley behind the Broken Tusk Tavern smelled the way all alleys in Valdenmoor smelled after midnight. Damp stone, old grease, and the particular sourness of men who had spent their wages poorly. 3 of them formed a loose crescent around a 4th figure, and it was the 4th figure that held Corvin Ashfeld's attention as he stepped over a collapsed crate and into the amber wash of a single hanging lantern. The man on the receiving end of their attention was short, heavy-set, and already bleeding from a split lip. A merchant, probably. The kind of soft-handed trader who wandered too far from the market quarter without understanding what the Tangles took from those who crossed it without permission. Corvin had seen the shape of this situation 100 times. He had lived inside it more than once himself, back when he was smaller and the city was larger and meaner than he had words for. He stopped at the edge of the lantern light. His hands were loose at his sides.
The 3 men registered him slowly, the way predators register something that steps into their territory, not with alarm, but with a kind of territorial recalculation. He was not tall by any standard. He wore a sleeveless, rough-spun shirt despite the chill, and his forearms bore the kind of layered scarring that only comes from years of fighting in places without rules and without referees. His jaw was square and unhurried. His dark eyes moved between them with the quiet efficiency of a man counting stairs in the dark. The largest of the 3, a half-orc with a neck like a siege post, took a step toward him. Corvin's right foot shifted back, his weight dropping into his hips without drama, and the half-orc stopped, not from fear, from recognition, because there is a particular posture that certain men carry, a kind of bone-deep readiness that the body understands before the mind catches up. It is not aggression. It is closer to gravity. "Walk away," Corvin said.
His voice was flat and unhurried, the way old wood is flat and unhurried. The 3 looked at one another. The half-orc made a sound that was probably meant to be a laugh. He was still making it when Corvin crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. What happened next lasted 11 seconds. Corvin did not count them. He never counted during a fight. He only counted afterward, when he was checking himself for damage he hadn't felt in the moment, which was how he noticed, when it was done, and all 3 men were lying in various states of horizontal complaint, that his left hand was trembling. Not from exertion. He had not been hit. He opened and closed the hand twice. The trembling did not stop. It ran up his wrist and dissolved somewhere near his elbow in a sensation he could only describe as static, like the feeling just before a lightning strike, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. His key was off.
He had known it for 3 days, since the morning he had woken from a dream he couldn't remember, with the taste of copper in his mouth and every joint singing a single wrong note. In the year since he had begun training under old Marsh, who was not a master in any formal sense, just a retired soldier who had spent 40 years learning where the body's rivers ran and how to stop them. Corvin had learned to read his internal current, the way a sailor reads tides. Most days it was steady, a quiet hum beneath his sternum, available when he needed it, dormant when he did not. It fed his reflexes, sharpened his senses to a hair's edge in a fight, and on 3 remarkable occasions had allowed him to do things that onlookers described afterward in voices reserved for weather events. But for 3 days it had felt like a flooded river, too much water, moving in the wrong direction, pushing against its own banks. He flexed his hand again. The trembling subsided, reluctantly.
The merchant was staring at him from the ground where he had sat down hard during the confrontation. Corvin reached down, took him by the wrist, and pulled him to his feet with the efficient courtesy of a man who does not particularly want gratitude. "Market Quarter is 2 streets east," Corvin said. "Keep the lantern side of the road." He left the alley the way he had entered it, without hurry. The Tangles, the web of narrow streets and crooked passages that made up Valdenmoor's lowest working district, were not particularly quiet at this hour. There were districts in the city where darkness meant silence. The Tangles were not among them. Cooking fires burned in windows above tanneries.
A group of halfling dock workers moved in a compact, cheerful cluster past a candle maker's stall that was somehow still open. Its owner, a gnome woman of indeterminate age, who had been selling beeswax candles on that corner for as long as anyone could remember, and who watched the world go by with an expression of mild philosophical amusement. Somewhere above, in the upper stories of a building that leaned against its neighbor like a tired man leaning on a fence, a child was crying and someone was singing softly in response. Corvin passed through all of it like water through stone, present, unremarkable, and alone. He had a room above a cooperage on Tether Lane, 12 feet by 9, with a window that faced an interior courtyard where the cooper's apprentices stacked barrel hoops during the day.
It cost him 4 copper pieces a week. It came with the understanding that he would occasionally settle disputes among the cooper's clients when those disputes became physical, an arrangement that suited both parties and required on average 2 interventions per month. He was halfway up the exterior stairs to his room when he heard the sound. It came from the alley beside the cooperage, a sharp, compressed scuffle, the sound of someone being grabbed, of a boot scraping stone, of breath cut short in a very specific way. And beneath it, barely audible, the sound of a girl trying very hard not to make noise, which is a particular kind of silence that carries its own frequency. Corvin's hand found the post at the top of the stairs. He stopped. His trembling left hand tightened once, and the wrong current beneath his ribs surged and then settled, unevenly, like water finding a new level. He turned and went back down. She was fighting remarkably well for someone in a gown.
That was the first thing Corvin registered when he came around the corner into the alley beside the cooperage. The girl, young, maybe 17, her dark hair half unraveled from a style that had been expensive to arrange, was not screaming, not frozen, and not cooperating. She had her elbow in the jaw of the man holding her, and her heel on the instep of the second, and she was doing both things simultaneously, with the kind of concentrated fury that suggested she had not arrived at this moment unprepared. There were 4 of them. 2 had her. 2 stood at the mouth of the alley, watching the street. Corvin's assessment of the situation took approximately 1 second. His assessment of the men took half that. They wore no livery, but they moved in the practiced, economical way of professionals, not street thugs improvising, but men executing a plan. The ones watching the street had their backs turned, and each had a hand resting lightly on a weapon, not drawn, ready.
He started with those boo watching the street because they were the greater problem. What he did was not technically a spell. Practitioners of the arcane had words for what Corvin did, and those words were almost entirely wrong, shaped as they were by an academic tradition that assumed power flowed outward from a trained mind through a memorized formula. What Corvin did was older and less tidy than that. He pulled his ki inward, compressed it against his sternum, the way you compress air in a bellows, and released it through the balls of his feet as he moved. The result was speed, a step that covered 5 feet in the time most men's reactions hadn't yet begun, and an impact when his elbow connected with the first man's temple that was disproportionate to his mass. The second turned and caught Corvin's knee in his solar plexus before he had finished turning.
Then the two holding the girl, who had, to her credit, used the distraction to bite the hand of one of them hard enough to draw blood. It was over in moments, controlled, efficient, nothing wasted. Except his left hand was trembling again, and this time it had spread. Not just his hand, but a faint resonance in his chest, behind the sternum, like a string plucked slightly out of tune. He breathed through it carefully. The sensation did not go away. It sat there, patient and wrong. The girl stood in the alley, her gown torn at the shoulder, looking at him with gray eyes that were furious and frightened in equal, careful measure. She was holding a small ornamental knife that she had produced from somewhere in her sleeve. Useless against armored men, but not nothing. She had not dropped it. He looked at the knife, then at her face. She looked at the men on the ground, then at his face. "Lady Maren Ashveil," she said, as though introducing herself at a dinner party.
Her voice was steady, which told him more than the knife did. "House Ashveil, and you are not one of my father's men." "No," Corvin said. "You are from the Tangles." "Yes." A pause. On the street beyond the alley, the city continued its midnight commerce, indifferent. "Then I am in a peculiar position," she said, "because the men my father sent to escort me home tonight appear to be the men currently occupying this alley's floor." Corvin looked again at the unconscious men. He had assumed hired mercenaries, but on closer consideration, the quality of their boots, the specific style of a buckle on the nearest man's belt, they were guard issue, city-sanctioned private escort. He crouched beside the nearest and checked his pulse. Steady. Then, because it was relevant, he checked the man's hands. The palm of his left hand bore a small mark, not a tattoo, not a brand, but an ink-pressed symbol in a style he had seen twice before in the Tangles without being able to name it.
A spiraling loop bisected by a vertical line. Corvin studied this symbol for 3 seconds. Then he stood. "They weren't trying to take you somewhere safe," he said. Lady Maren's grip on her ornamental knife tightened until her knuckles showed pale through her skin. But she did not argue, and she did not ask him how he knew. She simply looked at the mark, and then looked at him, and the fury in her gray eyes sharpened into something colder and more controlled. "I noticed," she said quietly, "when they led me the wrong direction for the 3rd consecutive turn. I began to make noise, and then..." She gestured at the alley around them, at the cooperage wall and the scattered men and the lantern rocking gently on its hook above. "And then," Corvin agreed. "He should have walked away. He was a fighter for hire who lived above a battle-maker on Tether Lane, and this was a noble daughter in a ruined gown, and the distance between those two circumstances was not measured in streets."
He knew the city well enough to know that whatever she had walked into tonight, it had roots he did not want to pull at. But the mark on the guard's hand itched at him. He had seen it twice before, once on a body fished out of the lower canal, and once on the wrist of a broker who had tried to hire him for a job that Corvin had declined on instinct and not regretted declining since. The mark was beginning to form a shape in his mind. Not a livery, not a guild symbol, something else, something that used legitimate faces. His key surged again, improperly, against the inside of his ribs. He pressed it down. "There is a place on Tether Lane," he said, "above the cooperage. It is not appropriate for a lady of your house, and it is also the most defensible position within 4 minutes of here. I am offering you the 2nd consideration, not the 1st. Lady Maren looked at him for a long moment.
Then she tucked the ornamental knife back into her sleeve with a precise, practiced motion.
"Lead the way," she said. Old Marsh had on saying about key and balance, Corvin had heard so many times he could reproduce it in his sleep. The river does not flood because it has too much water. It floods because something has changed upstream. Marsh had said it, usually while making Corvin hold a particular stance, until the stance became the kind of pain that teaches, instead of the kind that merely hurts. It had seemed at the time like wisdom packaged in suffering. Corvin had later come to understand it was also technically accurate. Whatever had changed upstream in him 3 days ago, it was not improving.
By morning, with Lady Maren asleep on his cot, she had fallen asleep mid-sentence while explaining the route her escort had taken, which told him how much adrenaline had been holding her upright. Corvin sat cross-legged on the floor and tried to do the thing Marsh had called settling, which was less meditation than a kind of internal survey, moving awareness through his body, the way you move a candle through a dark house, checking corners. What he found in the space beneath his sternum was wrong in a specific way. The key was not depleted. It was blocked. The current was present but jammed, pushing in 2 directions at once, which had the practical effect of a river forking around a boulder and losing half its force in the split. In a fight, he could still access it, clearly, but only in the way you can still draw water from a kinked hose, inefficiently, in fits, with the constant threat that the pressure would build past the kink and release all at once into nothing useful.
He had experienced this once before, at 15, after a fight in which he had pushed harder than his body was ready for, and something had wrenched loose internally in a way that took weeks to mend. Marsh had called it overspending, drawing from a reserve faster than the body could replenish, leaving a kind of scar in the flow's path. He pressed 2 fingers against his sternum and breathed carefully. The blockage did not respond. He heard Maren wait, not the sound of it, but the quality of the silence changing, the way the room's small sounds shifted when another consciousness entered them. She did not sit up immediately. He heard the particular stillness of someone remembering where they were. "You did not sleep," she said, without making it a question. "I don't need much," he said. "We need to move before midday. The men in the alley will have been expected somewhere." She sat up.
Her hair was fully unraveled now, and she had clearly chosen not to care about it, which Corvin noted as a detail relevant to her character. She told him more over the morning. She was the 3rd daughter of Lord Aldrich Ashveil, whose house controlled a significant portion of the grain trade in the city's eastern quarter. Her eldest sister had been taken 3 months ago, kidnapped, the City Watch said, by parties unknown, though the ransom demand that followed had been quietly and expensively met, and her sister had returned physically unharmed. A merchant acquaintance of her father's had lost a son in a similar manner 6 weeks later. 2 minor lords in the Eastern Ward had received warnings they had chosen not to report publicly. The pattern, laid out in Maren's precise, unhurried language, was not subtle once you held all the pieces together. They target families with liquid assets and a preference for discretion, she said. People who will pay rather than escalate.
My father paid. He was told it was a unique incident. It wasn't, Corvin said. No, she said. It wasn't. The spiraling mark. He had been turning it over since the alley. By mid-morning, he had a name to attach to it. Not a certain name, more the shape of a rumor, the hollow ring, spoken in the Tangles the way certain names are spoken, quietly and without elaboration, as though the act of saying them too clearly might attract attention. An organization that, depending on who you asked, either did not exist or had existed for many years and had simply never needed to be visible. That used legitimate employment, guards, brokers, dock workers, as a skin over a different architecture. That took people who had something worth taking
and returned them for a price that bought silence along with the body. It was, Corvin reflected, a nearly perfect machine. Clean, institutional.
Insulated from the kind of investigation that street crime attracted, because its clients were the sort of people who preferred their problems solved quietly, and its workers were the sort of people who disappeared back into legitimate employment between operations. He told her none of this, yet he was still assembling. What he said instead was, "Stay here. Lock the shutter." "Where are you going?" "To speak to someone about a symbol." He found the gnome candle maker on her corner at midday, as he had known he would. She was there every day, had been there every day for longer than Corvin had been alive, and operated with the unhurried permanence of a geographical feature. Her name was Paris, and she knew things.
Not because she sought them out, but because she sat at a corner where the Tangles and the Market Quarter and the Canal District all intersected, and things that passed that corner eventually left some residue in her vicinity, the way a still pool collects what the current drops. He crouched to her level. She was barely waist-height, even by gnome standards, and had the nut-brown skin and silver-laced hair of considerable age, and showed her the shape of the mark he had memorized from the guard's palm. Paris looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Corvin. "You found one of their workers," she said. She did not make it a question either. "Found several." She was quiet. Behind her, candles guttered in their rows. "The man who runs the ring," she said finally, "is not in the Tangles. He never comes here."
He is in the noble quarter, and he has been there a very long time. And the reason no one has ever done anything about it is that several of the people who might do something about it have received services from him instead. His kin surged. Wrong direction. Both directions at once, the flooded river spitting past its banks. His left hand gripped the edge of her stall until the trembling stopped. "Give me a name," he said. Harris looked at his hand, then at his face. "His name is Garrison Fell," she said. "And Corvin, that thing you're holding down in your chest, it won't hold much longer." He came back to Tether Lane to find the shutters open. Not forced. Open. And in the courtyard below, the cooperage apprentices had all gone inside, which they did not do unless there was a reason, which meant someone had given them a reason, which meant they had seen something that made inside seem preferable to out. Corvin took the stairs 3 at a time.
The room was occupied by 2 men he had not left there, and Maren was standing with her back to the wall with her ornamental knife out, and the quality of the standoff was such that no one had yet moved. The men were professionals, not the same men as last night, because those men were still in an alley somewhere, but from the same organization, wearing the same patient competence. The larger one looked at Corvin and made the same mistake the half-orc had made in the alley the previous night. He assessed by size, and his assessment took too long. Corvin hit the key, both directions, the split current, the flooded river with its boulder, and instead of fighting it the way he had been fighting it for 3 days, he stopped fighting. He let it go. What Marsh had said once, in a voice that was not his usual instructional tone, but something quieter. When the river can't find its bed, sometimes you have to let it flood. Let it find the new channel itself.
Fighting it just wears out the banks. The release was not dramatic. It was not fire or light or any of the things that witnesses to key events sometimes described afterward. It was simply a threshold crossed, the feeling of a kink releasing, of 2 halves of a current finding alignment, of something that had been held in two contradictory directions, resolving into a single unobstructed flow. And in that resolution, he moved. He did not precisely remember the next 30 seconds. That was normal, at the high end of what he was capable of. The body moved faster than memory could catalog, and what remained afterward was an impression more than a sequence. He knew that both men ended up on the floor. He knew that he had not killed either of them, because he never did unless there was no other geometry that worked. He knew that his left hand, when he looked at it, was entirely still. The blockage was gone.
He stood in the center of the room, breathing, feeling the current run clean and level and strong for the first time in 3 days, and had a single thought in the quiet that followed, which was upstream. Something had changed upstream 3 days ago. A fight, a decision, a threshold he'd crossed without knowing it. His body had been renegotiating its own capacity. Not a wound, not a drain, but a renegotiation. The kind that happens when a thing that has grown begins to understand that its old channels are too small for it. He looked at his hands. Maren was watching him from the wall. Her knife was still out. Her gray eyes held something new in them alongside the fury and the fear. Something observational and precise. The look of a person who has just seen something they are carefully memorizing. He tied the 2 men with the cooperage's spare rope. Then he sat down on the floor, because his legs had decided, now that the necessity had passed, to express an opinion about the morning. "You're going to help me," Maren said. It was not a question, but it was not entirely confident either. "I was going to help you anyway," Corvin said. "I just needed a moment." Garrison Fell's estate was in the Thornfield district of the Noble Quarter, nestled between a retired Atmos townhouse and the counting offices of a spice consortium. Legitimate neighbors, legitimate address, the organizational equivalent of a hidden door in a paneled library.
Corvin spent the afternoon gathering what he needed. Confirmation of the estate's layout from a runner he knew who delivered there weekly. The location of the secondary entrance from a laundress whose client list included the estate's household staff, and one additional detail from Paris, the night Fell conducted his business, which was not the nights anyone might expect, because Fell was the kind of man who planned around expectations. He went in through the secondary entrance at the hour before dawn, when the city was at its absolute darkest, and the watch had settled into the comfortable lethargy of the pre-dawn shift. He did not go alone. Maren had made it clear, with a focused calm that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, that she was not waiting above a cooperage while the man responsible for her sister's ordeal was addressed.
He had conceded the point, not because she was noble and he was low-born, and not because she had an ornamental knife, but because she had shown him in the course of a single night and morning that she operated best under pressure and understood when not to make noise. He disabled 2 guards. She navigated 2 locked interior doors with a set of picks she produced from the same sleeve that housed the knife, which she did competently and without explanation. They found Fell in his private study, a precise, thin-shouldered man in his 60s who looked like a scholar and organized human suffering with the same systematic rigor he appeared to apply to his very organized bookshelves. He was not alone. A senior lieutenant was present, and the exchange of looks between them when the door opened carried the specific quality of men realizing that their carefully managed distance from consequence had closed. What happened in the following minutes was not a fight in the usual sense.
Fell was not a physical man, and his lieutenant, when faced with Corvin's full attention, the current running clean and level and strong, made a reasonable decision. There was a great deal of documentation in that study, organized with the thoroughness of a man who trusted no one and therefore kept records of everything, which turned out to be a catastrophic strategic error on his part. There were names in those records, contracts, accounts, the entire architecture of the ring laid out in Fell's own hand, with the self-assurance of a man who believed the documents would never be read by anyone who could use them. They left him locked in his own study with his lieutenant and with sufficient rope. The documentation went with them.
Corvin delivered Maren Ashveil to his father's estate at first light, not through a main gate, but through the servant entrance, which was faster and less visible, and she accepted this without objection, which told him she had not spent the night thinking about gates. Her father met them in the inner courtyard, a broad, grey-haired man whose face moved through several distinct phases when he saw his daughter, all of them too large and too private to look at directly. Corvin looked at the courtyard wall. The documentation went to the city watch's garrison captain, not the captain of the noble quarter precinct, which Fell's records indicated was compromised, but the captain of the harbor garrison, an older dwarf woman named Stoneward, who had the reputation of a woman who had never found a bribe that interested her. Corvin left it at her door before midday. By afternoon, there were arrests.
The hollow ring did not fall entirely in a single day. Organizations of that depth rarely do. But its central architecture was exposed. And exposed architecture in a city where secrets are currency is the beginning of collapse. Corvin was back in his room above the cooperage by evening. He ate a cold meal he had bought at a street stall near the canal, roasted root vegetables and flatbread, unremarkable and exactly what he wanted, and sat at his window watching the courtyard below, where the apprentices had returned to stacking barrel hoops, which they did with the cheerful indifference of young men who had learned that the unusual events of a single morning are not necessarily the world's permanent condition. His key ran steady, clean and even, moving in its proper channel, carrying what it needed to carry without resistance or excess.
He pressed 2 fingers against his sternum out of habit, and what he felt there was simply the beat of a functional heart in a functional body that had spent 3 days finding its new size. Upstream. Something had changed upstream. He thought about the document he had left at Stoneward's door, about Maren Ashveil's grey eyes, and her ornamental knife, and her picks from the same sleeve. About Garrison Fell in his organized study, surrounded by the records of his own certainty, surprised to discover that the distance he had maintained from consequence was precisely the length of a single patient night. And he thought about something Paris had said, turning candles in her stall. The Tangles don't care who your blood came from. They care what you do with what you've got. He had never told her he was low-born. He had also never hidden it.
Outside, a barrel hoop escaped an apprentice's stake. It rolled across the courtyard in a wide wobbling circle, clanging cheerfully against the far wall before settling flat. The apprentice retrieved it with the philosophical patience of someone who had lost this particular argument many times before. Corvin watched, and his left hand rested easy on the windowsill and was entirely still.